Welcome back to Analysis. We've been looking at the crisis in the Central African Republic, where inter-communal violence has raised concerns that the state may be about to slide into chaos. President Hollande of France, the former colonial power, had this to say about the crisis. Let me reiterate here. We haven't finished the job. We're going to continue it, but in different circumstances, obviously. Firstly, because Europe is on the way. On the 20th of January, operations will be decided on both the security and humanitarian fronts. Secondly, a peacekeeping force will, at some point, be decided on and will go and take over. Finally, political initiatives have been taken. It isn't right for us to choose the Central African Republic's leaders. France is assisting, not taking anyone's place. Well, that's the statement that the French embassy here in the UK sent to this programme. Now, I'm rejoined for this half of the programme by my guest from the first half, and we're also being joined on the phone by Dr Berny Sèbe, who's lecturer in colonial and post-colonial studies at the University of Birmingham. Okay, James, that statement now, some of the guests, and we'll talk about this with them in a moment, were saying there's a kind of different take now from France. But I guess if you were a little bit cynical, you might say that that statement from Hollande sounded pretty much like French colonialism at work.
It sounds significantly worse than it is, I think. I think that it's true that France's engagement with its former colonies has shifted under this presidency, but that also represents a change that's been taking place sort of maybe for the last 15 years. And that France's ability to act in Mali and the Central African Republic is a representation of previous neocolonialism rather than an extension of neocolonialism. But, you know, from hearing you read it out, there's a bit of a tin ear problem there. You don't want to say things like the Europeans are coming. Now, what that actually means is that the European Union has proposed to send a force of 1,000 troops to help the African Union peacekeepers and to help the French peacekeepers, which could be a very good thing. But its framing leaves a little bit to be desired.
Lydie, I mean, you were saying that in the first half of the programme that, you know, there's a kind of different take by France. So do you think that this is a kind of problem of expression, that statement from Hollande, or do you think that perhaps the shift itself is more appearance than reality?
I think they mean well on this one, because it's the only ex-colonial power that still keeps forces on the ground in Africa, and this is where we should start our questions. Why do they do it, and why aren't others doing it? And this is why France is called when there's a crisis in a previous colony. And in this case, we have a dire humanitarian situation with over, I think, 1 million people displaced. There was nothing else to do. If you have forces on the ground, and you call other countries from the European Union to come and help. What really matters is the political process, and we need to be careful and watch whether France is going to try to influence it. But so far, I would say so good.
Tendai, I mean, the French model of kind of decolonialisation is perhaps different. I mean, that's why you end up with French troops still in Africa. It's a different process, isn't it?
Yes, certainly it is. It certainly is. Because even if you look at the history of a country like the Central African Republic, I mean, even though the Central African Republic did gain independence from France, in the first years of its independence, there were still French professionals that were placed in high places in government to work as policy advisors. And France itself would then supplement the Central African Republic's aid program and supply and also help to pay off civil servants and other educational programs in the country. So I think we've seen a different kind of, I guess, post-colonial relationship between the French and, for example, the British, who sort of cut themselves off from the countries that they had been present in.
Okay, let me bring Dr Berny Sèbe in. Thanks for joining us, Berny. Do you think that the French model, which, I mean, I suppose if you were to treat it unkindly, would be to say, okay, you can be independent, but the troops are staying here, and there's a lot stronger direct colonial influence than perhaps there has been in some other cases. Do you think that's going to be something which will worsen this situation?
Well, it's something which was definitely a reality in the 1960s when decolonization was conceived by de Gaulle and some of his followers, and the idea was actually to organize a good departure which would allow the French to stay in reality. So it goes beyond doubt that there was this concept of remaining on good terms with the newly independent countries in order to preserve France's interests as much as possible. But I think that we really need to distinguish between the 1960s and 2014, and especially the latest two presidents of France, Nicolas Sarkozy and especially François Hollande, have really tried to distinguish themselves from this initial French tradition of trying to remain involved in the political and military fate of its former colonies. And what is happening these days is actually mostly taking place against the will of François Hollande, because François Hollande initially did not know Africa very well and did not want the country to be involved too much in African affairs. But actually, it's been to a large extent forced upon him by the ways in which events took place in Mali last year, and with the call for help coming directly from the Malian state, and the disastrous situation which is taking place at the moment in the Central African Republic. I understand that the fact that France is actually working and taking place there and acting as a former colonial power might certainly be a problem because there are some implications. But what we have to look at is the situation on the ground and realize that something had to be done because we're on the brink of genocide. And rather than historical considerations, what matters at this stage is really the situation on the ground and prevent disaster.
Sort of move a little bit on from the kind of post-colonial frame of reference and just look at the country economically. What's going on that has helped to create this situation in terms of the economic structure of the country?
Well, I mean, not very much in the sense that the country's economy is really nothing to write home about. There's some diamonds, there's some other minerals, but I mean the vast majority of the population work in relatively low yield agriculture. It's not a particularly sort of rich prize to be won. I mean, if you look at the amounts of money which Dutodja, before he was ousted or asked to resign and then resigned, was requesting to support the treasury. We're looking at really quite small sums of money. So I mean, the fact that the Central African Republic is an underdeveloped state, and that a lot of that underdevelopment has to do with its colonial and its post-colonial history. It's not the kind of economy per se that this fight has been about. It's much more about what happens when you have armed groups around and the kind of prevalence of those kind of organisations.
So is it a kind of lack of economic development that's
lack of economic exactly, which you can't remove from colonial legacy, which you can't remove from France's post-colonial legacy. And I think if François Hollande says that he wants to move on from France-Afrique, he's been given quite a lot of the sort of benefit of the doubt, but I think he really needs to prove it. And the way he should really prove it is last month in Paris there was a meeting of African head of states, and I think 40 turned up, but it kind of got missed in the news cycle because it happened exactly when Nelson Mandela died. And France was suggesting that it would help Africa's own security architecture. And that's really the role that France should play now, is work out a way how it never has to do this again. Because if each time it's just France that intervenes, you might be helping the short-term stability of a country or of a region, but it doesn't help in the slightest the kind of long-term development, because as soon as is humanly possible, these kind of security and conflict things that take place in different parts of the African continent need to be dealt with through African mechanisms with African people.
Okay. Dr. Sèbe, what do you think the economic factors that might be at play here? I mean, it will be untrue to say that wealthy countries always hang together and poor countries fall apart, but still there is a relationship here, isn't there?
If I may, I'd just like to start by jumping on what has just been said earlier, by also pointing out the fact that François Hollande puts at the center of the French intervention the cooperation with other troops, because we should not forget that France sent only, quote-unquote, 1,600 soldiers. But there is a significant contingent coming from Chad, and there is also the African force, which already outnumbers the French. So there are around 4,000 African troops. There are more coming from Rwanda as well and other African countries. So this is already taking place. So obviously, because France has a Western-equipped army, it is able to provide some logistical support, which it is also getting from other countries like Britain or the US. But the French intervention is not like the interventions of the 1960s or 70s, where French troops acted alone. There are already more African soldiers on the ground in the Central African Republic than French soldiers. Likewise, in Mali last year, the French intervened also with a significant contingent coming from Chad, but there were also other West African countries involved. So that was just to remind also your viewers about the reality of the situation on the ground, of the military situation on the ground. We're not talking about the French acting on their own there. Regarding the economics, I would really agree with what was stated earlier, namely that there isn't any major source, of wealth for France, which is vital to France, similar, for instance, or comparable in any way to uranium in Niger, in another country of the former French colonial world. So we have some good reasons to believe that in the present circumstances, and also given the responsibility which France has had in the region as the former colonial power and as the country which was involved in some mismanagement of the post-colonial period, in particular through the period of Emperor Bokassa, for instance, in the 1970s, what François Hollande did was mostly out of humanitarian concerns, because that was a real disaster which was unfolding on the ground and which remained actually just unnoticed for a long time, for too long, until it became something which really had to be addressed at the earliest.
Lydie, what do you make of the economic components here? Is there an element that simply the society is falling apart because of the sheer levels of poverty and the state's inability to deal with those questions?
First, couple of things. I'd like to say that I compared the French intervention to the British intervention in Sierra Leone a couple of years back, when there were, these rebels. Regarding the economy, we have to bear in mind that there's a little bit of uranium, and there is a potential for oil at the border with Chad, and this has been a recurrent problem between the two countries. There is also an issue with water and Lake Chad. So it might, in addition to this, Centrafrique borders two ex-French colonies, Chad and Cameroon. So these things add value to the Central African Republic. But at this time, the country doesn't have many resources, as other speakers have said. And if France wants to go further in terms of independence, economic independence of its ex-colonies, one sensitive subject is the currency that is pegged to the French franc, to the euro via the French franc. It gives a completely different kind of relationship to the ex-colonial power, and it reinforces ties. We can dig into that if you want.
Yeah, just elaborate that for us.
The CFA franc is pegged at a fixed peg to the French franc and the euro. It never changes. The parity hasn't changed since 1994. It's not like a Ghana that has power and control of its monetary policy. If it wants to devalue its currency, it can let it float or fluctuate against major international currencies. The ex-French colonies, 14 or so countries, including CAR, keep their reserves at the Bank of France. So they don't have so much to say, and the ties are really important. So imports from France and the Eurozone are cheap in those countries. Unfortunately for them, a lot of them are basic commodity producers like cotton, cocoa, and so on. And they lose because of the euro is very, very expensive at the moment. And that's something that people haven't been brave enough to discuss and to tackle. And as long as this dies there, I don't think we can talk about economic independence. And if you're not economically independent, your political independence is also limited. But having said that, I think France genuinely went for humanitarian reasons, not to be accused. It was going to be accused of coldness and indifference in an ex-colony. It did what Britain did in Sierra Leone.
Okay, Tendai, what do you make of this question, the economic question? I mean, those are some interesting and powerful points that Lydie's made, and it does rather speak to the kind of continued imperial connection there.
Yes, it certainly does. I think when we're looking at the situation, at first when the rebellion began, the first thing that I sort of thought of was the big French investment in Bakuma, and whether there were any sort of French interest that could have motivated the French interest in this current crisis. But I think we've seen that sort of taking a backdrop, and that doesn't get featured much in the news, and that particular area of the country seems to be stable, and there's not much activity there. But concerning the militias themselves, they've actually been, even though the Central African Republic doesn't have much, whatever little resources that the country does have, the rebels have managed to exploit that, because diamonds have been used by the militias in order to buy weapons, and this is what has led to a ban on the global sale of diamonds from the CAR at the moment.
Okay, James, do you think the worst is over? Do you think the situation is stabilising?
It's difficult to say. It looks like reports in the last 2 or 3 days that it's more stable than beforehand. I mean, lots of people have been leading with this cannibalism story, but on the same day, just across town, there was 2 militia groups lay down arms and kind of shook hands. So I think there's a mixed story going on. But I just want to come back to something that Lydie said, if I might. I think that's an incredibly important point, and that it's the structural power imbalances, and it's the structural keeping down of the Central African Republic, which is of the largest importance. The fact that there are a few French troops who are there for a particular reason in a particular time-limited way doesn't really tell us about the power relation. The power relation is, most starkly put that the French Treasury can devalue all of its former French colonies, all of its former African colonies' currency overnight if it wants, which is what it did in 1994.
Lydie, let me just ask you a little bit about the coverage of this story now, because there have been some horror stories emerging here, but then there have been many horrible stories that say have emerged from the conflict in Syria. Do you think there's a kind of tendency on the part of the Western media to still have an attitude towards these kind of conflicts, which is that they're kind of the barbarian outbursts and there's no understanding them?
Yes, I share your views, and I think that a lot of coverage was one-sided, went to film one community cheering up the fall of Jotodia, and not showing the others, except for the horrors that have been mentioned, including acts of cannibalism.
Dr Berny Sèbe, what do you think about this? Do you think that we get generally in Africa, that we get a proper picture of kind of social forces that are producing these crises, or do we simply get a picture which says, it's a kind of still the dark continent, where reason doesn't penetrate?
I think that in general in the Western media there is a tendency to simplify the dynamics which are at work in African societies. And it is true that the ways in which these events are represented very often tends to be be based on a dichotomy between the good and evil, for instance, and trying to help one side. And in reality, the situation is much more complex. So I certainly think that there is a lot of work which needs to be done in order to show the multiple nuances of the African societies, where foreign intervention, which started first of all with slavery, then carried on with colonial interference, up now also to the consequences of the post-colonial period and some mismanagement of post-colonial decisions, which have led to the situations which we're witnessing. Because obviously the type of communal violence which we're witnessing at the moment in the Central African Republic does not stem from a change which took place overnight. So it's been accumulated over long periods of time, and there are some deeply rooted problems, some of which are also of financial origins, as you have rightly identified, and they need to be sorted out, also quite in depth, instead of just relying on a military operation. Though in the present circumstances, a military operation was necessary to stabilize the situation, but a lot of deep and long-term work is needed to ensure that it is successful.
And James, I mean, what do you make of the coverage? I mean, in a way, I guess, Think Africa Press, you were an editor at it, must have been, in part, I guess, established in order to correct some of the views in the...
Yeah, that's exactly the case, and I think exactly as your guest has said, and as you said, that there's been a real tendency to just kind of boil things down into some idea of kind of ancient animosities, which will just sort of spring out with with no reason, and they're very there are reasons for these things, and there's agency on the part of the actors and all the rest of it. And yeah, exactly. And Tendai's written several articles for us which have tried to reverse that kind of narrative. But one slightly hopeful thing, I think, as I've noticed in sort of mainstream media's coverage of both this crisis in the Central African Republic and also in South Sudan, is that it started in both cases incredibly badly. It's just saying this is just ethnic, or this is just religious, and this is just the sort of thing that happens in these places. Maybe we'll throw in a bit of an idea about terrorism as well. But over time, the reporting has improved. It's in no way perfect. There's still lots of problems with it. But there was, a debate on Radio 4 about how the South Sudan crisis was being presented. And a couple of days ago, the BBC, admittedly, at the end of an article and quite short, did have a piece saying, well, perhaps the framing of this crisis as just being Muslim-Christian is problematic. So there are improvements. OK,
well, on that small chink of light in a dark situation, we're going to have to end the programme, but we will be following developments in the Central African Republic and indeed throughout Africa on future editions of Analysis, so please do rejoin us.